Hi, everyone. Excited to get a chance to share with you today. I want to start by just giving you a little bit about my own personal journey, and then we'll go deep into those 5 principles. But I want you to know a little bit kind of where I started at with this process, because really the whole issue with thinking about how do our wounds and how does health and healing all play together. As a physician, you can imagine I had specific training that taught me about the body and that taught me about health and healing. But knowing things and then really getting a heart deep understanding of them, not exactly the same thing. So what happened in my particular situation, I started off really thinking that if I just continue to do work and do all the different things that I had in my life to accomplish, keep checking off all my to-do lists, getting all the boxes checked, all the I's dotted and T's crossed, then I should be able to, as a physician, remain at a healthy level. And what I found very quickly was that that's a recipe for burnout. I burned out and I hit the ground hard. It got to a point really in my life where I had 2 toddlers. They were the ages at that time. They were 2 and 1, well, 2.5 and 1 year old. And I remember coming home one day with them from daycare. And I was so exhausted. My body hurt. At that time, I was at one of my heaviest weights. It hurt just to move. And so I remember coming home and setting them in front of the TV. And when I sat them in front of the TV, all I could think about was, oh, I need a nap, or I need something to really just to give myself a chance to start feeling a little bit better. And I was so tired, I didn't even want to leave them because they were too young to just kind of leave alone, right? So I remember just laying on the floor in the foyer at our house. They were in the living room and I could see them and hear them. But I was so tired. I remember laying on that floor and thinking to myself, God, if this is what I've been working for, is this the reason that I, went through school and, got the student loan debt and all of that stuff that comes with trying to strive towards a career? If this is all there is to it, I don't really want to do this anymore. And some people have asked me, were you suicidal? Were you depressed? I never even put a term to it, because I didn't even have the energy to think that hard about it. I just didn't want to do that anymore. I knew that something had to change, and it had to change quickly because I couldn't keep going the way that I was going. And it was during that time on the floor that I recall really having a sense of the peace of God touch my life in a way that changed everything about how I look at health and healing. Because for so long, I thought healing was this thing where, I'm an internist. So healing was where I write the prescription, I check the labs, that was what healing looked like to me. And to me, weight was just an equation. You eat too much or you exercise too little, and that's all there is to it. And let me tell you, if you've had any experience with either of the two, you know that both of those are incorrect concepts, because weight has so much more to do with our own emotional, spiritual, and internal wounds that sometimes help keep us in that place of not truly getting to the level of deep healing necessary so that we can then start having restoration in every area of our life. So that's what I want to spend some time looking at today. I want to walk you through kind of some of the things that I had to learn in that process before I could start getting on track to being able to consistently start seeing my weight and my health improve. From having, to take blood pressure pills to keep my blood pressure under control, to learning some lifestyle changes that actually reverse that. And when I say lifestyle changes, I'm not just talking about diet, and I'm not just talking about exercise. I'm talking about some heart wound healing lifestyle changes, some mental changes on how I looked at myself and how I viewed God, and getting deep to the core of what those wounds were that were keeping me in a place of unhealth. So let's take a look at those 5 principles of health and healing. And really the very first one is understanding that healing requires acknowledging the pain. We live in a generation and a society where pain is looked at this thing that we just try to avoid at all cost. And unfortunately, trying to do that means that To alleviate the pain, we will medicate with whatever we can get our hands to quickly. So we see this in many forms. You see some people who resort to alcohol, and you see some people who resort to drugs. And for some of us, we resort to food. Food becomes our medication for stress control, for depression, for anxiety. It becomes a way of numbing the pain so that we don't really have to address it at times. And so to begin, we have to acknowledge whatever that pain is that is really keeping us in that place of seeking relief. Through the scriptures, we see lots of examples of this. And one that really stood out to me the most comes from John 5:6. And it's when Jesus asked a paraplegic who had been ill for many years, do you want to be made whole? Or in different translations, it talks about, do you want to be made well or healed? And as a physician, that was always a very strange question, because I never thought about asking someone who showed up in my medical practice, right, for an appointment, do you want to be better? Do you want to be made healed? Or do you want to be whole? That never was a concept to think about. So it always perplexed me. What exactly is at the root of that question? Because Jesus doesn't ask questions for his benefit. He knows the answer. The question is for our benefit. So when asked, do you want to be made whole or well, really what that's doing is making you think about, are you willing to start doing really start evaluating the process of acknowledging the pain that you feel in the current place of brokenness? I think brokenness is something that we have to get on our grip with, because brokenness is something that we seem to run from. We don't want to show others our brokenness. We don't want to acknowledge oftentimes our own brokenness. But brokenness is something that's very universal. Just as pain is a universal concept and it's necessary for the healing process. You know, in medicine, if you come to a physician's office and you say, my tummy hurts, my knee hurts, whatever it is, the very first thing we do is start poking on it. We poke till it starts hurt, till it really hurts, right? So you actually scream out or some way so that we can see the depth of the injury. It's the exact same way with our spiritual and our emotional and our mental wounds. If we aren't allowed to touch them, if they're not allowed to be exposed, you never know the depth of the injury, and you never can get to a place of true healing. And so sometimes when you're sitting maybe in church and someone shares a testimony and the tears start falling and you don't understand why you're crying, or the pastor says something and maybe he's talking about do you feel loved? Do you feel worthy of love? Maybe he's talking about, do you feel like you belong in the family of God? You know, if you grew up like me, if you grew up without a mom, it might be a hard concept to comprehend. And you don't understand why it pulls on your heart in a way that makes you ache. But those aches, if not acknowledged and recognized and really addressed, can then become pain that we try to cover up and put a bandage on that can never heal it, that will only keep it in a place of injury and wounding. The second thing I want you to take a look at is to think about, for wounds to heal, they require an intentional time of healing. You have to be very intentional about how you're going to get to that place of healing. So with the second slide, I want you to take a look at this scripture from 1 Kings 19. This is where we're discussing about Elijah. And in this particular portion of scripture, you may recall the story. It's right after Elijah has done these great feats for the Lord. He's called down fire, and he's basically done the supernatural. Great example of living out faith to the fullest. And you see soon after that he goes into this period of can only really be described as depression. He's weakened, he's down, he feels like he at the end of his own life. And when I see that story, it oftentimes reminds me of that point when I was laying on the floor. And what happened right after that period, when I got off that floor, and after, really feeling like God had shown me some specifics about what I needed to do to start the healing process, one of the very first things that I felt like was the next step came from this story in Elijah. Because what happens is Elijah, you'll notice within the story, he goes, and the first thing he does is it talks about him going to sleep. Well, going to sleep for an exhausted person is a good thing. And sleep is where a lot of restoration and healing occurs, right? And I love that during that time of sleeping, it talks about multiple times when the angel touched him and helped strengthen him. Because when I was laying on that floor, that was one of the first times that I felt a strengthening. And that strengthening came just in being very intentional about stopping the activity, stopping the need to feel like I had to work till exhaustion, allowing myself to get an understanding that I needed to be willing to slow down and not expect the healing to come solely from a prescription or a medication or something like that, to be intentional about creating the room and the space in my life for healing to begin to occur. And so I want you to think about if there are specific wounds that seem to continuously arise in your life, if every time you think about getting healthy, there seems to be a block that comes up. It could be any of the things we've already mentioned. It could be something that maybe happened in your past. It could be some type of injury that happened in your past, something that makes you automatically feel as if you're in this battle, this emotional and this mental battle with yourself. When that happens, I want you to start thinking about, is there room in your life for that place to heal up? Or have you kept busy to not have to allow the room to heal? Because sometimes our busyness, I feel, really is our attempt to rush past the pain. So we keep so busy that we never have enough time to allow ourselves to really go deep into that healing process and into that level of pain relief that we truly want. And I want us to take a look at that entire story with 1 Kings 19, because when we start looking at that, one of the things that it talks about is that Elijah is called up to the mountain of God. 40 days, 40 nights, called up to the mountain of God. And while he's up there, there's a period of restoration that God brings him to, so that by the end of that story, he is returned back in power. Now, I want us to spend a large amount of our time today looking at how do we get restored back to power when you recognize you have a wound, when you are willing to allow the time and the space and the room for healing. What does the restoration process look like? And how do you apply it in a way that you can immediately start being able to see some improvements in the different areas where you may feel depleted? And that's the third part of this, which is really about the restoration. How do we get back to a place of restoration? The concept I want you to start thinking about, when you think about allowing yourself space to heal, I want you to think about allowing yourself space and time to rest. Because really, restoration occurs while you rest. I say this oftentimes, rest equals restoration. During your times of rest, something should be improved. There should be an improvement from how you entered into the rest to afterwards. Now, many of you are probably thinking, well, I already rest. I rest every day. I take a little bit of time to rest every weekend. But I want to challenge you with this. Most people are not aware that there are actually 7 different types of rest. And this is the area that I've spent most of my research as a physician and as an author really addressing. What are these 7 types of rest? And why is it that most of the world is burned out? overwhelmed, depleted, exhausted. Why is now when we ask people how are they doing, the answer isn't simply I'm fine, it's I'm tired or I'm busy, because we've gotten to a place where rest is not understood anymore. Most of us equate rest with sleep. And as important as sleep is, it is not the same thing as rest. So what I want you to think about is there are 7 different types of rest. And I'm going to go through each of these 7 types. And what I want you to do is to actively think about, to do the self-diagnosis of which of the 7 types you may be most deficient in. Because this is the thing, the area of the deficiency will make it harder to heal in that area because you're trying to heal from a place of emptiness. Now, God can deal with your emptiness. He actually invites us to come empty, but he invites us to come empty to be filled. So my prayer for each of you on this webinar today is that by the end of our time together, you'll be moving from a place of overwhelmed, where you feel like all of these things that are weighing on you are keeping you kind of pressed down and pushed down, from overwhelmed to a place of overflowing, where you are then able to pour out into the lives of your family and your friends and all those around you, because you no longer feel the woundings and you no longer feel the pressure and the stress from a life that is just too full. So the first type of rest we're going to take a look at is called physical rest. Now, physical rest is the easy one. However, it is divided up into the passive and the active components. So when we talk about physical rest, we're looking at things like the active component would be things like prayer walks, it would be stretching, it would be anything that improves your circulation or your lymphatics. So if you have a tendency to have a lot of swelling in your legs or your feet, if you have a tendency to have aches in your legs at night when you lay down because the circulation's poor, this is where active physical rest comes into play. It improves the circulation and the lymphatics so that you can get healing in your body by restoring those 2 things. And then we have the passive physical rest, which is what most of you are familiar with when we talk about rest, which are naps and sleeping. And so sleeping, is the one that I think most people can easily figure out if they are getting enough of. Usually the norms are between 6 and 8. Napping is really depending on your own body's ability to function well with that. Some people can take power naps, others that's just draining to them. So that's kind of a personal choice depending on how your body responds. But with any type of physical wounding, the body heals and repairs itself at nighttime. So during the time when you're doing, and I won't get overly technical, I am a physician, so I have a nerdy brain, but during the nighttime when you're sleeping, you're going through different realms of non-REM and REM sleep. And so stage 3 and 4 of the non-REM sleep are the deepest levels of sleep that you go into. And it's in that 3 and 4 non-REM sleep where the healing actually occurs. And so I love that in so many examples in the Bible, the story with Elijah, we see God talking about sleep. And, even with when God created woman, Adam goes into this deep sleep. I love that whole concept of how there's restoration and newness of life that comes in those deeper levels of sleep, because that is actually what we see in our bodies naturally. The second type of rest I want you to think about is mental rest. Now, mental rest, let me tell you what it looks like if you don't have it. If you don't have mental rest, what you'll experience is where your thoughts are constantly jumping from one thing to another. You lay down to sleep at nighttime and your mind is thinking about all the different things you need to do, you have to do the next day. It's going over conversations you had earlier in the day where you wish you'd said something a little bit different than how you said it. All of those are components of a mental rest deficit. The mind can't find a place to settle. So it's constantly jumping from one thought to the other, and it stays very sporadic. It has a tendency to lend itself towards anxiety because there's no peace that's in the mind. Now, how do you get more mental rest? One very simple thing that can be done is journaling. So if you have a tendency to do that, let's say you're lay down at night and your thoughts are constantly jumping from one thing to another, write down whatever those thoughts are, and specifically in the area of emotional and spiritual wounding. If you find that if someone says something to you, let's say a boss asks you to do something different, and immediately your head goes to, "Oh, I'm not good enough. I can't keep up with everybody else." Or any of those negative thought patterns that are belittling you and pulling you down, rather than allowing that conversation to continue to play in your mind, write it down and then leave it there. The thing about the brain is when you take it from here and you put it on something concrete like a journal or a piece of paper, it allows the brain to release it. And that releasing of it is what allows you to then to go into deeper levels of sleep. However, if you keep ruminating on it, it's harder for your brain to release it, and you will get trapped kind of in that mental process and find it hard to really get to the level of sleep you want. Now, the thing about that is any conversation where you are kind of running down a negative thought pattern, a negative path, negative beliefs about yourself, about God, if you ruminate on them long enough, you will start accepting them as your own truth because that's what you're repeating to yourself. It's kind of like you're allowing your mind to kind of keep running down that rabbit hole. And so part of mental rest includes thinking on those things that are noble, that are lovely, that are true, that are pure, and refocusing your thought patterns to what the Word of God says. This is why scripture memorization is so important for most of us, because when the negative is what the mind wants to go to, which it always does, the brain always wants to run down the negative path because it's the easiest path for us to travel. For it to go to the positive path requires an intentional retraining. And so pick a scripture. I often tell people if it feels like remembering scripture is too difficult, start off with just focusing on a characteristic of God. If your thought pattern is that, you're not worthy or God's not good towards you or bad things seem to be happening, focus on a characteristic of who God is. God is faithful. God is holy. God is love. You pick whatever the characteristic you need to focus on, and then keep your thought patterns focused on that rather than down that negative cycle. The next type of rest is spiritual rest. And this is something that Elijah shows us in this particular passage, is how to do spiritual rest. I love that it starts off, God was not in the fire. He was not in. And then all of a sudden he's in the still small voice. Because what spiritual rest looks like is by getting past the religion part of our relationship with God and really focusing on the spiritual, the relational part, the part that has a father's heart towards us, the part that covers us and loves us and protects us, the part of God that allows us to fully trust him. And I know for myself personally, a large part of my healing from those emotional and spiritual woundings, and I'll share what my particular one was. My specific spiritual wound that I had an issue with was a death that happened very early in my childhood. My mother died in childbirth, and so I was raised by my great-grandmother. And so I always grew up feeling like, okay, I get God is good, but I didn't feel like he'd been good to me. My life didn't start off good. So when you start off with that type of spiritual wounding, then it's very easy to see how that can lead down a pattern where it's hard to trust God. It's hard to trust someone that you feel has wounded you. And so we have to really understand how spiritual rest and really all of these different types of rest can play a part in our healing process. Because if I can't build a relationship with God, then I have no way of really getting to a point of healing that particular wound. And I'm not saying that these are things that happen overnight, but what happens is it's kind of a layer upon layer. You start with kind of the smallest little foundation of, okay, God, I'm going to repeat that you are good, even when good is not happening in my life. I'm going to keep saying it. And I'm going to keep reading scriptures about your goodness. And I'm going to keep putting myself in position to feel your presence and to hear your small voice. And you keep doing that. And as you're doing that process, what happens is the healing comes slowly. There's an old saying that says, time heals all wounds, which I hate that saying, because time does not heal all wounds, but there's a process that happens with healing. And so when we start doing the process, we start experiencing the healing in those areas. So we talked about the first three, which is physical, mental, and spiritual. Now, the next four are ones that most people are less familiar with, but they're ones I want to make sure that you are aware of, because they are the ones where I find that most people tend to have a deficit simply because they don't know it exists. And because they don't know it exists, they don't have the terminology to describe where the deficit or the weakness in their ability to strengthen themselves is at. So the first one I want to start with is social rest. Social rest requires that you start looking at your relationships to see what relationships are life-giving. They're pouring back into you. They are building you up. They are edifying you. And what relationships seem to be draining to you. They require things from you. They call upon your gifts and your calling. Now, I want you to understand that a draining relationship does not mean a bad relationship. Your kids are probably a draining relationship. They need things from you. Your spouse may be a draining relationship. Your elderly parents may be a draining relationship. It does not mean it's a bad relationship. So disassociate the draining relationship from the word bad or negative. It simply means, how does that relationship pull upon your personal energy resources, your abilities? And then the life-giving relationships are the ones that are pouring back into you. Now, the reason to do this is simple. You can't keep giving from an empty vessel. It doesn't work. And that's where most of us have lived. We've lived in a place of trying to focus all of our attention on these relationships that are pulling from us, that are needing us, that are requiring things from us. And we set aside the life-giving relationships as, I'll get to that when I have time. For healing to occur, you must understand there has to be life-giving people pouring back into you. You cannot be the only life giver in your realm of influence. You must be in, and this is why I think it's so important in the Word, where it talks about those Titus 2 women, where it talks about older women training younger women, and it talks about having community and the body of believers coming together. This is why that's important, because you have to have that. Because when you don't have that, you get to a point of depletion where, and that's what we saw with Elijah. He felt like he was the only one. I'm the only one left that's fighting for God's good cause. He didn't feel like there was anybody else that was, doing what he was doing. So whatever the area is that you are pouring out, make sure that you're finding some time to get in the presence of life givers. The statistics, and I won't throw a bunch of medical statistics at you, I promise, but I got to give you this one. The statistics show that adults have fewer friends now than ever. Now think about that. Now, when I talk about friends, I'm talking about where you're actually having the power of presence, meaning that you're eye to eye with someone. Now, it could be eye to eye even on like Skype or WhatsApp or some of that type of stuff, Facebook Lives, whatever, or FaceTime. It could be any of that kind of stuff. but what they're talking about eye-to-eye contact, because there is a power in presence that actually helps us to feel understood, appreciated, and loved that you don't get from texting or social media interaction. I know, I just stepped on some toes and I'm sorry, but that's what the statistics show. And I think most of us have seen that in our own lives. You can be highly engaged on social media and still feel very alone and not understood. However, when you're in the company of others, where you can see their head nods, or you can see or they can touch you on the shoulder, or you can see their facial expression, and you can see their concern. There's a difference in how that affects you. And there's a healing that happens when you feel understood, where it's not sympathy, but empathy, where they are in it with you, and you feel that connection there. So that's social rest. And then there's something called emotional rest. Emotional rest is the rest that we get when we are able to be authentic about our current situation. When Elijah got to the point where he heard God's voice in the still small voice, and as a still small voice, I love that the very first thing that God says is, "What are you doing here?" Like, when God asks a question, it's not for God, it's for you. It's a self-analysis of what's going on with you. Think about, do your own self-analysis to be intentional about what got you to this point. And so with emotional rest, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at being very authentic about where we are in that moment. Now, the great thing about emotional rest is that emotional rest means that you're not judging the feelings, you're not validating the feelings, you're not trying to explain the feelings, you're stating the feelings. And for many of us, what happens is, rather than just stating the feelings, where am I right now? What am I doing here? What is here? Is here depressed? Is here anxious? Is here angry? Is here confused? Is here misunderstood? Is here lonely? Whatever. What is here? So it's expressing what here is without judging it, without putting a shame label onto it, without trying to make it better or fix it by just calling it something that it's not. Emotional rest is stating what it is and then allowing yourself to then see, why is it that you feel that way? And being very open to receive whatever help is needed. When I do a lot of mental health advocacy, and I do a lot of speaking in churches on mental health. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. Honestly, my speaking schedule is packed every single May because of that reason. Because within the church, there's this label sometimes that still gets applied that if you love Jesus, how can you possibly ever be depressed or anxious about anything? And let me explain something to you. Mental, first of all, that's putting a stigma on something. But mental health is not something that a few people deal with. Mental health is something every one of us has to deal with. Every single person on this webinar has to actively deal with their mental health every single day. If you flipped on the news today or opened up your email, you probably got 3 emails from someone telling you about COVID-19 and about the coronavirus. And you got the news giving you all this different stuff and all these different fears and all these things that you can be afraid of and all this other stuff that's going on. But are we just supposed to pray and not be aware of that? I believe 100% in prayer, but I don't believe in telling someone who is clinically depressed that prayer is going to solve that problem without them having to have any counseling and any medication. I think that is emotionally wounding, because that's limiting, first of all, to me, how God works. I believe God can work through prayer. I believe God can work through antidepressants and medicines. And I believe God can work through therapy. And sometimes he heals through one modality. Sometimes he heals through all three of them with the same person, all working together to get to a place of total healing. And so when we're looking at emotional rest, I want you to really think about, do you feel as if you can state your emotions without allowing those emotions to be a label upon you? Because having feelings does not make something wrong with you. Every person has to deal with their emotion, with their mental health and their emotional health. But we have to be willing to not allow those feelings to become labels. The next one is sensory rest. Now, sensory rest is one that is very simple to kind of understand. If, senses are the lights, the sounds, the smells, all of that. So we live in an environment where there's ongoing sensory overload. And so if your normal day-to-day requires you to use computers, be around bright lights, fluorescent lights, if you're a stay-at-home mom and you've got little ones screaming at high-pitched sounds all day long, if you work in an office with phones ringing and, bells and people talking and all of those can be sensory overwhelming. So sensory rest is getting back to an appreciation of silence and spending some time alone in quiet surroundings. Darkness, if you're going to sleep at night, making your room as dark as possible so that your body, actually your circadian rhythm, kind of gets settled back down and goes back into the normal light dark phases so that your sleep is a little bit deeper. All of those are things that relate to sensory rest. And then finally is creative rest, which personally is my favorite, and the one that I found over time that I probably had one of the biggest deficits in. At the time, I was doing a lot of teaching, and so I was teaching undergrad and grad students. And, with teaching, you're constantly trying to explain things so that your visual learners will get it and your auditory learners will get it, and you're trying to switch it up so that everybody can understand. I didn't realize that creativity wasn't just for artists and musicians, that when you have to be innovative or think outside the box, that is also a form of creativity. And it pulls on your creative energy and resources so that you have to restore that. Now, how do you store creative rest? You've probably experienced this if you're someone who ever feels more at peace or calm when you're at the ocean or at the lake or around bodies of water. That's a form of creative rest. Creative rest is really allowing yourself to appreciate beauty for the sake of beauty itself, for allowing it to awaken something inside of you, to inspire you, that childlike awe and wonder that comes when you're in those natural settings. Things like the lake, or if you go to the park, looking at flowers, going for a nature walk. So that's the God creations, but it also works the same way with man-made creations. Some people have very similar experiences in art museums, or if they're at the symphony. So it's allowing beauty to awaken something into you. It's getting back to that childlike type faith, where you look at the ocean and you think, how? how, God, how? How did you create something so vast that I can't even see where it ends? How did you tell it to stop right here? Why did it stop back there somewhere or over there somewhere? How did you know, how did you put the stars in the sky? And it just leaves you with that childlike awe of who God is. And it requires you to slow down life a little bit to appreciate that. And that brings that creative rest by kind of awakening inside of you the understanding of you are creative, even if you're not painting or drawing, that your natural behavior has tendencies towards creativity to be able to do the work God's called you to do. I want to remind you, if you have any questions, be sure to include those in the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end. Let's move on to number 4 now. 4 has to do with boundaries, and I think it's important to understand that boundaries are required. For most of us, we try to act like we want to avoid boundaries because we don't like confrontation. But boundaries are confrontational. They have to be for them to be effective. And they're required to keep our priorities intact so that things don't get pushed to the side that are important to us. And I think one of the best examples of this comes from Luke 5:15-16, where we hear Jesus, and he's talking about withdrawing away from the crowd to pull apart for a time to pray. Now, the crowd was a part of Jesus' assignment, right? He was there to minister and to disciple. And so that was a part of the good work he was sent to do. But I love that he gives us this example of pulling away, of drawing away at some point in time, because that spiritual relationship was a priority. And so he was putting up some personal boundaries to make sure that what needed to get done was done. And that's what many of us have to do with making sure that we are getting the type of rest needed to stay at a place of health, to be able to heal those wounds and those deficits when they pop up, because we are keeping our priorities straight. We are understanding that we can't keep pouring out of empty and actually be able to be as effective as we desire to be. And then our 5th area that I want to look at is that we have to settle the issue regarding our worth. I think for so many of us, we get caught up in this concept of, do I deserve to be able to have time for myself? We talk so much about self-care, and one of the hardest things for people who struggle with getting the self-care they need is that they put their own value lower than those that they're serving. Whether that's their family, whether if you're in leadership, maybe it's the people you're serving as a leader, but we put ourselves at a lower level, and you have to really settle that issue with our worth. That our weight, our look, our roles, our titles, none of those things are what makes us worthy. That really our worth is simply based on we are sacred vessels holding God's Spirit inside of us. That Holy Spirit within us makes us already worthy. The same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead is already inside of us. And I want to conclude with this scripture from Jeremiah 30, verse 7, that states, I will restore you to health and heal your wounds. And I think that's such a wonderful promise for us to end on, because healing those wounds is part of the process of restoring us to health. And to heal those wounds requires some dedicated time to rest and to pull away and to allow ourselves to get what we need to be able to be strengthened in the areas that we need to be strengthened. And I want to invite you to visit restquiz.com. On there, you'll be able to do a free rest assessment. And what this does, it'll actually give you, it takes about 5 minutes to do, so consider it part of your self-care, but it'll help you be able to see which of the 7 types of rest you're actually most efficient in. You kind of gave a quick assessment, and so it'll either confirm what you said or maybe show one that you weren't expecting. What I'm finding is most people, it reveals one you weren't even expecting, because sometimes the one that actually is giving us the most difficulty, we don't quickly recognize. So I encourage you to visit that there at restquiz.com. It is a free assessment. And once you get your results, feel free to shoot any questions to me at support@drdaltonsmith.com, and I'd be happy to answer them for you. I'll turn it back over to Helen.
Well, thank you, Dr. Saundra Dalton. We're so excited that you're here, and wow, the topics. The rest quiz is very informative, I can tell you. I've done it, and it's definitely something I highly recommend. Several people wanted to know, is there a specific book of yours that goes over these 7, or do all your books? I know somebody was looking into that, wanted to have a question about that.
Yes, the book that specifically addresses the 7 types of rest is called Sacred Rest: Recover Your Life, Renew Your Energy, Restore Your Sanity. And the book that specifically addresses wounds is called Come Empty: Pour Out Life's Hurt, Receive God's Healing Love.
Right. Wonderful. Well, thank you. Well, for all of you, we're so glad you joined us today. For any of you new to First Place for Health, I wanted to go ahead and also give you show you a slide. You can go to our website, firstplaceforhealth.com, and the shortcut to that is fp4h.com. We also have a free item. You can get our free ebook that gives you a jumpstart weight loss mail. And our whole mission is a Christ-centered weight loss. And of course, for us that have been with First Place for a while, everything that she said today resounds so strongly with us, because we all know that it's not just about weight, just exactly what you said. It has to do with making sure all things are in alignment. And then finally, I wanted to invite you, any of you that wanted to come to one of our events. We do have an event May 3rd through the 5th. It's a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. We are partnered with Sandy Cove Ministries. They are in Northeast Pennsylvania. And you can find more information at our website if you go to events or firstplaceforhealth.com/events. And so we just love that. Now, I noticed that we have a few more questions. So as we round out, I just wanted to see one question, Dr. Saundra, is can you please further address or explain the lymphatic part of physical rest?
Yes. The lymphatic part, well, with physical rest, like I said, there's an active and a passive. So the lymphatic part has to do with the active part of physical rest. It's making sure that you're not staying in a stagnant position for too long. You know, we now, well, I won't call it a joke, but we have a saying in medicine that being sedentary is the new smoking. You know, it used to be we tell people don't smoke because it's ruining your health, and we give a list of 15 different diseases you get from smoking. Well, now that list is from being sedentary, from not staying active, from not keeping your body moving. And so one of the key things that we recommend and that the science supports is called body fluidity. And what it means is not allowing your body to be in a stagnant position for prolonged periods of time. You may have heard people talk about things, let's say, if you're on a plane ride, get up and walk or pump your ankles so that you don't get blood clots. Well, the lymphatics and the blood vessel systems run kind of side by side. And so when you're pumping one, you're automatically kind of helping the other because you are moving that circulation around. And you're wanting to do that. So if you notice that you're having, let's say, a lot of swelling in your legs throughout the day, and you sit at a desk for prolonged periods of time, you want to be mindful of that. And so part of that could include having a stool under your desk where your feet are not hanging all the way down, but they're up a little bit so that the pressure up under the chair is not pushing and cutting off your lymphatics and circulation. I know this is very probably in depth, but it has to do with the body ergonomics of how you're positioned. And so I find a lot of people, especially women, and especially if you have, like me, you have bigger thighs, may find that certain chairs put a lot of pressure up under your legs and knees. And so, and if you stay in that position for too long, you all of a sudden notice you're having varicose veins pop up from places that you don't want varicose veins popping up, or you start noticing swelling in places you don't want swelling in your lower legs. And so that's something that's very simple. There's these, you can get them online. I won't name a place because I don't want to say the wrong thing, but you can get them online on online retailers where they lift up your feet just a little bit off the floor and take that pressure off from underneath. And that helps with the circulation automatically. And then obviously standing up and standing chair, standing desk, and all of those are great resources too.
Great. Well, we have 2 questions about guilt, so I'll just put them together kind of. It's
Okay.
One is, how can you suggest I get past the guilt? And then the other person asked how I will need to think carefully about guilt, that they put them myself for feeling tired without having a family of their own. So maybe like I don't have all these reasons to feel tired, so they feel guilty that they're tired. So I guess they're both about how do I deal with this guilt that I
With
have.
guilt. Well, I'll try to deal with them separately, quickly. The guilt about why you're tired. Fatigue comes in so many different ways, just like we talked about the different types of rest that goes along with the different types of rest deficit. So you don't have to have a family to have an overwhelming life. You can have an overwhelming life as a single person. So that isn't judged on whether or not you have a family or not. It's just the kind of how you're using your energy and how you're pouring out yourself. As far as the guilt in general, I think a lot of times the guilt comes as a form of condemnation, and that form of condemnation is really just accusations. The word states that we have an accuser that accuses us day and night, and I feel like that is where the guilt comes from. And so for me, when I start feeling that, I'll just be very transparent. For many years, I was up and down, up and down, up and down with my weight, and if I gained, some of it back and lost some of it back and gained and lost, every time that happened, I was like, you're such a failure, and the guilt of that as a physician, where people are coming to you, asking how to lose weight, and you're battling with it yourself. So you can imagine there was a lot of guilt related to that. And so something that really helped me with that particular situation is understanding that I'm human. I'm human. So that means I need to be aware that I can't expect perfection. God doesn't expect perfection. All I can do is give my best in the moment that I'm in. And so sometimes when I start feeling that guilt and condemnation come on, I ask myself, are you doing the best you can right now? And the best I can right now may not be great, but it's the best I can right now with where I'm at. And so it's allowing yourself to have grace for yourself and being able to accept that you are human and you're not gonna get it perfect every time.
I just want to thank you, Saundra. Vicki Heath, our national director, is watching, and she said, thank you for sharing. It's been fabulous, and more to come from with you and us. And we're just so glad you were here. So everyone, thank you and have a great time. Oh, and a correction. Sandy Cove is in Northeast Maryland. I said Pennsylvania, which is where I used to live. And it is very close to the Pennsylvania border, but it's in Northeast Maryland. It's north of Baltimore Washington International Airport for anyone that wants to fly in. But thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time.